hopefully you brought your syllabus from last time because we're going to start on page 11. And we're entering an argument now that actually goes through the 25th verse of chapter 4. Now, I don't know how much, let me see, some of you are seniors, some of you are sophomores, right? Do I understand I've got some sophomores in here as well? So I know that you're all in different places in your theological training. But you may or may not be aware of the fact that particularly with the Apostle Paul, you're going to be dead in the water in terms of understanding him if you don't know what it is he's arguing for. If you don't know what it is he's trying to prove or establish, and leave that, Tyler, like a big umbrella over the particulars are not only going to baffle you, but they're going to cause you to ask questions of the text it was never designed to answer, and will all the more frustrate you. Okay? Now, for example, in where we're going to go today is a portion of Scripture that from which is oftentimes asked the question, is Paul saying that a person that's never heard the gospel can be saved by their understanding through nature? Okay, that's a question that's been asked for centuries. And that question gets asked from the text we're about to study. And one of the reasons that it gets asked is because they're asking of the text something Paul never intended to address. Might he be alluding to it? Possibly, but that's not his point. So we want to try to understand what is his point, okay? What is it that he's trying to wrestle with? Now, I said to you here on page 11 that beginning in 118 and going through 425, he talks about various aspects of God bringing people into right relationship with him. What's necessary for God to get people in a right relationship with him? Or if we would just use a simple term, what's necessary for God to bring salvation to people? Can you believe it? I just walked out of my office without my Bible. Put a pause. Put a pause. I'll be right back. Oh, that's okay. I've got it.
I had it already for you. Thought maybe you could read it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, from the left to the right?
Right to left.
Right to the left. That's what I meant. The right to the left. Well, thank you. Wow. Arabic? Yeah, not my forte. Now, where does he start? Okay, you've got this situation that he wants to bring people into a right relationship with him. So where do you start? Well, Paul says you start by understanding why is that even necessary in the first place. In other words, I didn't even know, Chris, there was a relationship problem between me and God. Tracking? So if you don't know there's a relationship problem, how on earth will you know something needs to be done about it? Okay, that's where he starts in his argument. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? And so what he says here is that appreciating God's gracious act of getting things right with him necessitates understanding the universal reign of sin that leads to his wrath being revealed. So you got to start, Frida, by realizing there's a problem between me and God, okay? And that problem makes it perfectly legitimate for him to demonstrate his wrath towards me. Now, that's not necessarily a fun doctrine. I don't know that that's necessarily like what draws thousands of people to the church, but somehow, fundamentally, that has to be understood and it has to be grasped. There's a relational problem that means I'm subject to his wrath. Okay? So that's where Paul's going to start in these verses. Now, that wrath comes in two forms. When you think of the wrath of God being poured out on a person, what comes to your brain? What does that mean to you practically? If I say, Joe is going to experience the wrath of God, what do you think in terms of? Frida?
Lightning.
Oh,
Storms coming.
Okay, storms coming your way. So, okay, how about somebody else? What is that? What comes to your brain? Suffering?
Like traumatic. It's like very intense. Like it's not just like, it's like huge suffering. I don't know, what's the worst kind of pain ever.
Pain, okay. Do you think of it in terms of now or when he sends them to hell? Matthew?
When he sends them to hell.
Okay, how many think of it in terms of Matthew when he sends them to hell? You are a victim of the wrath of God. How many are on that continuum? Raise your hand. Okay. How many are more on the continuum of what they might experience from him now by way of negativity? Okay. Interestingly enough, Paul says it's both. When you talk about the wrath of God being poured out on a person as a result of the broken relationship, it actually has both aspects to it. Yes, Chris?
So is he contrasting the concept that you explained to us about salvation? Because salvation is not just being saved like in the end, but it's renewing everything in your life now.
Exactly. So salvation has a now and a future dimension to it. Wrath has a now and a future dimension to it. Okay? Both. Now, what is the now aspect that Paul's wrestling with of the wrath? Doesn't that make sense? We want to know, what does he mean by the now? If there's a now aspect to it, what is it? Well, look at your handout, because it's very interesting. The wrath of God that is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of human beings is in the form of both a present reality and a future reality, as I said. Here's the present reality: that God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to shameful lusts and to a depraved mind. Here's what that means. That if you want to persist in a broken relationship and a lifestyle of broken relationship, God will leave you on your own to experience all the consequences of what you're doing, and he will not cushion it. Okay? The consequences of just that sin itself is a form of wrath. So you will not be protected by him from those consequences. You will not be protected from those consequences snowballing on you and making you even more and more, the terminology he uses, like an animal. That's a form of the wrath of God. So think of people's broken lives. Is it sad? Of course it's sad. Is it heartrending? Of course it's heartrending. But Paul will say that to some degree, they painted themselves into that corner. They chose to stay in that corner. And now they have to live out the consequences of that, because I can't step in and cushion it. Now, do you think that that makes people at times angry with God? Yes. Let's use just a very graphic example. People have unprotected sex, and then they're angry because they're not protected by God from the diseases that come with it. And Paul is saying you cannot think that way. To go down that continuum, you have got to be aware of the fact that it can put you onto a course in that God is not going to stop. And he calls that a form of God's wrath. Am I making sense to people? Okay? And he paints it in a way, Ryan, it snowballs. And you really almost become more and more like an animal. Okay? You lose, a depraved mind is you lose your ability to make any sort of good moral or even rational decisions as things snowball in the lives of people that are absolutely determined to have certain kinds of lifestyles. That's huge. Okay? So what do you think? We're going to go there. What do you think is important to Paul to establish in terms of God and his justice in all of this? Where do you think he's headed? Is this God's fault or yours? Yours. That's what he's trying to establish, Frida. But who do we oftentimes want to blame? God. And Chris, that's what he's going to wrestle with theologically. That's huge to him. Okay? In other words, a path to healing starts with acknowledging what's the problem and who's the problem. Make sense? And if you're not willing to admit that, you're not going to get on the path to healing. That's why, freebie, denial is such an unbelievably destructive force in the lives of people. Okay? And that's why you've got something like AA, think of it whatever you want, or Celebrate Recovery, is built on what first fundamental principle, Chuck? Do you know? You admit you have a problem. You're going to acknowledge the reality. You're not going to scapegoat it. Okay? So I'm Gary Matsdorf and I'm an alcoholic is not designed to reinforce a negative self-image. It's designed to pinpoint the source of the problem so that the healing can come. And that's what he's trying to establish here. Everybody with me? That's the now part of it. What is the future part of the wrath of God? It's going to be found in chapter 2, verse 5. You're storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. That's referring to what Revelation calls the great white throne judgment. That's when he sends people to eternity in hell. That's the second phase of the wrath, if the right standing issue isn't dealt with at some given point. Okay? If the broken relationship isn't mended. Just a couple of technical things here. I said to you, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts and to a depraved mind, is built on the imagery of a judge handing over a prisoner to his just punishment. In this case, the punishment of the terrible cycle, as I've been saying, of ever-increasing sin. Now, such punishment might be reformatory for some, because, thankfully so, some people, after wallowing in the pigsty for a while, get the message. Do they not? In truth, I know that I got to hold this in relative tension, but sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is to feel the consequences of what they've chosen to do, as opposed to always being cushioned from those consequences. Again, that's where enabling comes in. You can enable a person and cushion them from consequences. Because thankfully so, Gwen, these lifestyle issues can be reformatory. But history proves, unfortunately, for most, they are not. People will unfortunately stay in these negative cycles all the way to the end and never have it broken. That's what, unfortunately, we find from history. And that's the kind of thing that rips our heart out. Okay? So God's not spiteful or vengeful. It is simply as one commentator says, that man apart from God regresses to a lower level of animality, and that's what Paul is very interested in. Okay? Quote at the bottom of page 12. So do you understand his argument? Okay. You're never going to get the relationship mended. You're never going to get in right standing until you first realize there's a problem and you are responsible for the problem. Now translate that into pastoral terms. How do you preach that in our culture? How do you talk about that relationally with an unbeliever? It's an art. Because particularly in our culture, Chuck, you know, the day of you're a filthy, angry sinner in the hands of an angry God like Jonathan Edwards probably doesn't captivate in our culture. Okay? It probably just turns people in a different direction and is counterproductive. But we somehow have to figure out how to package it because that message doesn't change. Does that make sense to everybody? But that's where you've got to take your doctrine and wrestle with it in the pulpit or wrestle with it in your daily relational life. How do you incarnate these truths with a sensitivity to the cultural surroundings that you're about? Okay? Just like in parts of the third world today, you can still do a tent crusade or a street meeting. They don't work by and large in our culture. So does that make sense? So that's why I always want you to think, how do I enculturate this? How do I take this doctrinal truth now? That's what I got to hang on to, Tyler. I can't let this go. But I somehow then have to navigate it into the lives of people that I'm working with. You know, are you tired of the drugs? You know, are you tired of the illicit sex? Are you tired of the alcohol, the denial, whatever? Those can become doors of here's where you're headed. All right? Making sense? All right. Well, I got us off to a really bad start today because I didn't even have the text read. So let's go back and read it before we finish it up. Who wants to be a reader? This is a long one. So we'll start with you, Mr. Alexander. Would you mind doing 18 to 25 for me, son?
Yes. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man, who by their unrighteousness surpasses the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, has been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that has been made, or have been made, excuse me. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up into the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creatures rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.
Great. And 26 to the end of the chapter? Tyler?
For this reason, God gave them up to the dishonorable passions, for the women exchanged natural relations for those that were contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passions for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give a proof
Well, you probably noticed that this is probably not refrigerator verses. They're not like, oh, yay, claim my promise for today. But they're hugely insightful. Because, let's follow him now, okay? There's a problem between me and God that I've got to get settled. That problem is manifesting itself in certain lifestyle issues for me that make me thereby experiencing his wrath. Now, because he's very interested in establishing the justness of God, because you got to remember that particularly in his culture, he's battling the pagan thought that gods can be very whimsical, they can operate out of anger or even frustration, okay? So now he wants to paint a picture of God as being just in this wrath, Chris. So he has to ask this question. Are the people who are doing what they're doing aware of what they're doing? Okay, that's hugely important in his thinking. Because if they're culpable, do you know what that word means, Mr. Victor? I'm sorry. I don't. We're becoming too close of friends. Are they, if they're guilty, okay, if they're guilty, then they've got to have some sort of a cognition of what they're doing, an awareness, okay? So he begins now this incredible argument that basically says, yes, they are guilty, because yes, they do know what they're doing. Now let's follow him in his argument. I said here on page 12 that God's response of wrath is painted against the backdrop of the willful intentionality with which people give themselves to sinfulness despite knowing enough to know that God has a moral code to be followed. What he's basically saying is they know very clearly what they are doing, okay? They're not doing it in total ignorance. They suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. And although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Now, before the class is over, we're going to wrestle in detail with those verses because they're kind of challenging. But do you see the big picture of what he's basically saying there? He's using terms like suppress, which means they have a knowledge and they're putting a lid on it, okay? He's made certain things plain to them. And although they knew these truths, they chose something else. Do you follow his argument, Chuck? That's what he's saying. Now, the basis of how they came to this knowledge is a $1 million question. We'll talk about it in a moment. That's a different issue, okay? How did they get this knowledge? Bethany, right? Isn't it, right? I'm trying to learn everybody's name. Bethany, how'd they get this knowledge? That's a different issue, okay? He's saying they've got it, okay? And so they're making a choice against their knowledge, okay? This failure to give God his due and to receive life as God's gift is his way of saying, here's the core of sin. People know what they're doing, and they choose to do it anyway. Now, it's very interesting, his examples. Did you notice his examples? He's got 4 categories of examples. Could he have chosen a whole lot more examples? Of course. But these are the ones that the Lord led him to choose. For example, those that are idolatrous know they're being idolatrous, and they're making a choice to be idolatrous. The same of those practicing sexual impurity, which is basically a big brush for any kind of sexual immorality. Then he picks out one as a subsection of that, probably because of its place in ancient Roman culture, homosexuality. And then he goes to 21 sociological ills. Things like greed, envy, murder, strife, gossip, arrogance. And it's so important to me to realize he's got all of those things lumped together. We pull some of them out as worse than the others. So Sister Susie or Brother John can be the biggest, you fill in the blank, arrogant person in the church for 100 years, and we don't think a thing about it, okay? But let somebody have a one-night stand, they're toast forever. And Paul puts them together, and that's not to minimize sexual immorality. Everybody tracking with me? Don't go quoting me wrong to Pastor Wayne. But it's very interesting that he's got this whole list of things that reflect harming other people as examples, okay? So he said, these things are examples of what I'm talking about. And it's a result of their depraved mind. In other words, they opened themselves up to a certain path, they got on it, it snowballed on them, and the more they got into it, the more they lost their ability to ascertain this is wrong. Okay? They became desensitized to it. And notice this. Here's his capstone. They not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them. They are not only self-justifying, but congratulating those who are practicing the same kinds of things. That's what he says. It has snowballed into all of that. But remember the intentionality of his entire section. People know what they're doing. They know it's not right, and they're choosing to do it anyway. Everybody follow that argument? Now again, we're going to come back at the end of the class to how is it they know it's wrong. Following me, comma? Because he makes an interesting statement here about they learn it from nature, whatever that means. But follow his big picture argument. Any questions? What he's after? Okay, now again, remember his purpose. It's just like going to the doctor. What does the first thing that the doctor has to do before he can give you medicine? Okay. Diagnose. And what if his diagnosis is wrong? What if you go in with pains in this area and he gives you indigestion medicine when it's a heart attack? What's going to happen to you?
It's not going to fix the problem.
Yeah, you'll probably die.
Yeah.
Yes, right. So is the diagnosis important?
Yes.
Hugely important. Has to be accurate. But you, as I was saying a moment ago, this diagnosis for human beings is a tough one. Okay? That's where you truly need the Holy Spirit helping. Now, chapter 2, the argument continues. And this one is so, if it weren't so tragic, it would be funny, because basically now he shifts, Tyler, to those who say, thank God that's not me. Only to find out, Chris, oh my gosh, it is me. Okay? That's where he's going to go in the second chapter. To those great Pharisaical moralists who point their finger at others and say, not me. Do I have a reader of 1 to 11? Chuck?
Therefore you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment, for in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things, and do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each person according to his deeds. To those who by perseverance in doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life. But to those who are selfishly ambitious and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, wrath, and indignation, there will be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek. But glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For there is no partiality with God.
Great. All right. Now let's continue with his argument. Page 14. I've said here, continuing with the matter of the sinfulness of all people. Again, a sinfulness that brings God's wrath, both now and in the future, if it's not dealt with. Paul now turns to those who sit in moral judgment of the people he's just been talking about at the end of chapter 1. Okay, I love this quote. Paul now moves on to show that those who sit in judgment on their fellows are as guilty as those they judge. There is a natural tendency to justify ourselves for the wrong we do by condemning people who do other evils that we think are worse. The Pharisee is always present in each one of us. Don't you love that? And it's very true. Now, by the way, we can talk later if we have time and if you're interested about, is there a place for judging one another in the body of Christ? The answer is yes, there is. But that's not this kind of judging, okay? This is the kind of judging that says what they're doing is worse than what I'm doing, or thank God I'm not doing any of those things, when in fact probably in those 21 sociological ills is your name if you're going to be true to form. Make sense? Now, what you need to know, and I don't know if you know this or not, but what you need to know is what was just read, he's using an ancient argument style known as a diatribe, which basically means that he has entered into a dialogue with an imaginary person. Okay? So when he says, you, Victor, it's not you, the Romans. It's you, the imaginary person. Okay? The person that he assumes is going to take this position, Chuck. Okay? That's his ancient argument style. So he's entered into a dialogue with them. Okay? It's called right here a diatribe. That's the ancient style of argument, comma. So, these are moralists who fancy themselves exempt from God's judgment. And as the chapter unfolds, he probably, Ryan, has religious Jews in mind more than anybody else. Okay? And again, I think what the Jews might have done then, Christians tend to do today. We have the same kind of thing going on. Okay? So he says, so when you, a mere human, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think that you will escape God's judgment? In other words, what he's basically saying as the chapter unfolds is, do you think that just because you are a Jew, that have all of these things in your heritage, you can live however you want and it doesn't matter to God? That's basically what he's saying. Do you think you can draw on your heritage? Do you think you can do like the Pharisees did and say, Abraham is our father, so we are thereby exempt? Do you think you can do that? That's what he's arguing with. Because if you know anything about Judaism of the day, isn't that the very thing they did? They would appeal to their heritage as sort of like a get-out-of-hell-free card, independent of how they lived. And so he's tackling that argument. Do the same things likely refers to the list of things he was just talking about, particularly the 21 sociological ills. Now, he says, let me tell you something. You better get this straight. We know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. In other words, God is making an assessment that's accurate, Sarah. He's not making a wrong assessment. He has facts. He doesn't just have rumor. He has facts to back up what he's doing. Okay? Now, Chris, you may not think those facts exist. Do you know what I mean? You might think you're Lily White. He has very different facts at hand. Okay? And denying the reality does not change the reality. Does that make sense to you, son? That's what he's saying. Okay? He has factual proof that these moralists are engaging in these practices, and hence, who are they condemning? Themselves. Okay? Again, Chuck, this establishes the justice of God. And you remember when we studied the book of Revelation, how important it was that God's justice be established in pouring out his wrath on people and sending people to hell. Paul's wrestling with the same thing. And believe you me, Tyler, somehow we got to get that in our culture today, because God gets a bad rap. Does he not? Okay, because we tend to blame him for things that are in fact not his to blame. That's the important thing. Okay? Now, what do you think makes this doubly horrific? He says what makes this doubly horrific is you are God's covenant people who have the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience. Not so you can take advantage of them, Gwen, and say, I'm a Jew. This doesn't apply to me. I've got a get out of hell free card. Not so that you can do that, but they are intended to lead you to repentance. In other words, the more biblical understanding you have, the more it's just of God, Tyler, to ask more of you. Does that make sense to everybody? The more biblical knowledge and understanding you have, the more it is perfectly just of God to ask more of you. That's what he's saying. Okay? And they're throwing stones at people that have less understanding than they, and they're not even doing what those, and they're doing the same things as those people with even more understanding. That absolutely causes Paul to pull his hair out, that understanding. Now he says, here's the general principle I want you to walk away with, Paul says. Page 15, God will repay everyone according to what they have done. Now, he's not trying to establish here how you get saved. Don't go down that track yet. Oh, is he talking about getting saved by works? No, you've missed his argument. His argument is your lifestyle says something about who you fundamentally are. Okay? Your lifestyle is a reflection. That's his thinking. And that's why I can look at your lifestyle, Paul says, and get some indication of who you are at the core. That's how he's arguing. Okay? There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. But there will be glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, because God doesn't show favoritism in his assessment. Okay? Let's put another pause there. I'm going to come back to the rest of page 15 in a minute. But everybody following his argument, what he's trying to get up against? Now he's going to keep it going. Who'd read 12 to 16? Chris? Then we'll come back to you, Victor.
For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus.
Great. Now here's the 30,000-foot picture, and then we'll dive into it. Here's what he basically says. He says, you know what? Let me step back for a minute. And here's the case. You know what, Victor? There are unbelievers who don't know a tenth of what you know, who live more reflecting God's principles than you do. That's really what he's saying. Now that is cold. That's daunting. but it is an assessment that they have to grasp, because they're going down a rabbit trail that's blinding them. In basic terms, that's what he's saying. Now, translate it to our culture. Truth be told, there are sometimes unbelievers who at a lot of levels represent more integrity, even more morality than believers. Is that not true? Sometimes they have less of an attitude. It's like, you want to see bad attitudes? Join the church. You know, that's kind of my assessment. And so basically, that's what he's saying, Matt. That's true. Now, should it be that way, Matt? Of course not. That light and that understanding should lead to something different. Doesn't always. We're going to wrestle with it later in the semester, why not, but it should lead to that. Now, notice what I've said. Paul's main point here is to show that God's level playing field of judgment doesn't give the Jews a decisive edge merely because they possess the law. Okay? Just because you own a Bible, okay, doesn't mean he just, oh my gosh, they own a family Bible. I'm just going to overlook everything. You know, that's basically what they're saying. May never have cracked that book, but that's what they were basically saying. We are heirs of the law. God cannot think that way. That's crazy of him to think that way. That's what they were actually thinking. Okay? And he's saying it doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. Possession of that understanding, if you don't do that understanding, doesn't mean anything to God. Sinfulness requiring condemnation if you don't get saved is universal, and judgment is meted out according to the light you have. All who sin apart from the law, who would that be? Gentiles, people that knew nothing about the old covenant, will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law on the day when God judges everyone's secrets through Jesus Christ. Now, what's he arguing for? You can ask a lot of questions of that text that it's never going to answer for you, but here's what he's saying from 30,000 feet. He's saying, number one, it's doing the law, not just possessing it in your heritage, that matters. Okay? So you cannot hang on to the coattails of your heritage. It doesn't work, Paul says. Okay? Were they special people? Were the Jews special people in God's economy? Of course they were. But that special heritage was designed to show up in life, not just show up in heritage. So just the fact they had the law but weren't living it doesn't count. And furthermore, do you know, as I said to Victor, even Gentiles who don't have the law oftentimes do by nature things required by law, showing that the spirit of the law is written on their heart. In other words, people have an inner moral compass to a large degree, he says. And they will oftentimes live that moral compass better than people that have more revelation. So don't go saying, just because I possess it, I'm free from living it. Okay, that Paul will never let you say that. But you follow his argument? All right, let's take a couple. Now, hopefully by now you can understand what Paul's arguing for. Okay, remember he's still arguing for, I got to get right with the Lord because there's a problem. And the problem is fundamentally me. Okay? And because I'm the fundamental problem, it manifests itself this way, this way, this way. This is what I do as a result of that fundamental problem. Now he's taken a little side trip in chapter 2 and addressed those who say, thankfully it's not me. I've got Judaism in my blood. And so then he says, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Okay? Now he finishes off the chapter by further discussing the details and the implications of, you can't just appeal to your Jewish history and your Jewish heritage if you're not going to live that heritage. Okay, you can't do it. Okay, as wonderful as the privileges extended to you are because of your heritage, it doesn't count when the dust settles if there's not a lifestyle that comes in sync with it. All right? And so he tackles it now from two aspects, and that is talking in more detail about the law and then talking about the covenant of circumcision. All right, 17 to 24. Wants to read that for me. Ryan?
But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and improve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law an embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teaches others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? Stop at 21.
24, please.
Oops, sorry. You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For, as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you.
Great. And Victor, 25 to the end.
For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So, if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but Jew is one inward, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God.
Okay. Now again, as I said, he's coming at this now from two components that are huge in Jewish thought. Okay? Now, I'm sure that you all are aware of the fact that by this time in history, things have evolved in Judaism, and two of the things that were the most important to them were their written law and the covenant of circumcision. Those were huge trademarks in identifying them and their heritage. So now they're using them wrongly. Tracking with me? They're leaning on them in a wrong way and hoping again that they're get out of hell free cards independent of how they live. And so he's going to tackle both of them. All right? Now, page 17 of your syllabus. Resuming his diatribe, the you becomes crystal clear. Now you, since you call yourself a Jew. Now, what he's after in the paragraphs that were just read by Victor and Ryan is not immediately obviously clear. But I think if we'll step back, it seems to be a challenge once again to the Jews' sense of superiority over the Gentiles because of their heritage in the law and because of physical circumcision. Now, Jew, which had come to replace Israelite or Hebrew to define them as an ethnic group of people, prided themselves on these 6 commonly held beliefs, okay? This is what sets us apart, they said, from all the rest of the people in the earth, okay? What sets us apart is we rely on the law, we boast in God, we know His will, we have an ability to approve what is superior, we are instructed in the law, and we are guides for the blind. Now, that was their cultural thinking. Now, if you're aware of the Old Testament, you can see where they got those things, Ryan, because they are embedded in the Old Testament. The problem of it is the spin they'd put on it. Does that make sense to you? That's the problem, okay? But they would have said, wow, these are 6 privileges we have. Now, Paul's not arguing with those privileges. That's not his point. Yeah, that's true. But here's my hypothesis. Do you know what an hypothesis is? Okay. You have an if-then clause, okay? If this, then this. The hypothesis is the then part. Make sense? You tracking with me? So here's what he's saying, Ryan. If you have those 6 things, and in fact you do, then here's my question to you. If you preach against stealing, then why are you stealing? If you say people should not commit adultery, then why are you committing adultery? If you abhor idols, then why are you robbing temples, which means why are you partnering with the Gentiles in some sort of a commercial business to make money off their little statues? Why are you doing those things? Okay? If this is your heritage, Chris, why aren't you living it? That's his greatest concern. And he says, let me tell you something. You think those things are going to free you from the wrath of God? You think those things are going to exempt you from God's wrath? Here's the truth. You are dishonoring God and actually causing his name to be blasphemed among the Gentiles. Quoting from Isaiah. So not only, Gwen, are you not getting a get-out-of-hell-free card, you are actually doing God a tremendous disservice in the earth. Oh, my goodness. That's a bit of a slap in the face. I wouldn't say it's exactly mamby-pamby preaching. But his heart's passion, Devin, is to try to wake them up. Because they're trapped in something that is so deceptive. Okay? They're trapped in leaning on their heritage and not seeing their own personal need. And they failed to realize they are not practicing what they're preaching. And here's the important thing, Chris. Not because they're struggling. Sometimes I don't practice what I preach simply because I'm struggling with a besetting thing. They're not practicing what they're preaching with a whole lot more willfulness and intentionality. Okay? Because it's not that important to them, to feel the need to practice what they preach. Okay? That's totally different. Okay? And it's not going to help you. That heritage is not going to help you. It's a tremendous heritage, and it's a tremendous privilege. But when the dust settles, it's not going to help you. And it puts you in the exact same level playing field as all these Gentiles that are practicing idolatry and all of those other things that you say, not me. Okay? Now what about the last one, the section that Victor read? I said here on 18 that Paul closes the chapter by discussing the fact that physical circumcision, which you know, hearkening back to Genesis, was a sign of admission into the covenant, does not in and of itself shield you any more than possessing the law from God's judgment. There has to be an accompanied lifestyle. So he outright says, circumcision has value if you observe the law. Now again, culturally, they would have known what that meant because it was a common rabbinical saying that no circumcised person could go to hell. No Jew could go to hell. That was their thinking. See? Independent, again, of their relationship with God as a result of that or their sign. Okay? It's sort of like, and I say this with all due respect, but just by way of an analogy. I was baptized as a baby, that's going to hold me, okay, on through to Judgment Day. independent of any lifestyle or commitment to God along the way. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's tantamount to that same kind of a thing. Okay? Now, Paul says this is ludicrous, because if you break the law, you have become as though you've not been circumcised. He doesn't mean you lose your Jewishness, but he's basically saying that heritage doesn't work for you, okay? That physical sign doesn't work for you, okay? Because you've missed the core of what it's all about. It's just like, I'm sure most of you know, that when the Roman Catholic Church started infant baptism back in the 4th century to deal with a very huge theological problem, they intended it to later be followed up by adult baptism, okay, when a person had actively made that commitment. And it was only designed to hold a person up until that point. Much like for us, we lean on what? To hold the child until that day. Their dedication, right, okay? But what happened in church history, Ryan, is that original intentionality got lost, and the adult baptism kind of got pushed out of the scene, and people started holding on just to the infant baptism. Tracking with me? Okay. And that's kind of what happened here, okay? What was designed to be kind of like a starting point became the ending point. And that's why he's saying it doesn't work, okay? Now, in the same vein, I'll close with this. He goes on from the specific to the general. The one who's not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law or desires to pant after God, okay, will condemn you, who even though you have the written code in circumcision are a lawbreaker, okay? It's the person who's doing it, who's panting after God, endeavoring to reflect that, whose proof is in the pudding that really matters before the Lord. It's the inward that cannot be seen, the endeavor to seek after God by faith and live in accordance with his precepts that wins his acceptance, regardless of your nationality or spiritual heritage. That's his whole argument. Okay? All right, 2 things, and then we'll be done a couple of minutes early. Number 1, any questions? Are you tracking with me? Does it make sense? It's pretty exciting, isn't it? Oh, and then the third thing is I got to go back to the verse we missed. Second thing is, what are you hearing? What did you hear today? Did you hear anything? I rambled on a lot. We're all dirtbags. Is that the Eugene Peterson version? Okay. Yes.
Clarify what you said earlier about infant baptism. So we're saying that baptism or that dedication is, in a sense, indoctrinating them into the family of God until they can make the choice to willfully follow.
That's the intentionality. With the Roman Catholic Church, because baptism is salvific. Do you know what I mean by that, son? That water baptism is necessary for salvation, okay? They baptize infants. Because water baptism for us is not salvific, we don't feel the need to baptize. But we do want something that brings the faith of the parent into the life of the child until a later point. Yes, right. And Rome instituted that at a time when there was massive death of infants, and they realized that they had a theological problem because they said there's no salvation without water baptism. So with that theological problem, you better baptize a baby.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay?
So he wrote this letter, Paul wrote this letter knowing all their problems, but he was saying that it was a good church?
Yeah, no. Well, remember now, see, this is what I think we've got to keep in mind, when I said last time that he's not so much in this letter addressing a single church as the church globally, as a whole. And so here, it's not necessarily even the Jews in the church at Rome, but Jews at large. The thinking of the Jewish nation that he's after. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, so that, like, this letter probably was
Circulated. Yes, right. Right.
cool.
Undoubtedly. Any other questions, or what'd you hear? Yes.
Well, I don't know. I'm just shocked. Of all the times I've read the Bible, read Romans, I just never pictured God as real angered because of Christ coming in between us. And I have just never read it as now. I just read it as
Future.
the past.
Oh, the past.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And,
Yes.
and so when it's just kind of scarier to think that he's angry, can be angry at us. Like,
Well, he's not angry at him. Well, wrath means he must deal in justice. I don't know that I want to establish an emotion to it of anger, but he must respond with justice, Frida. Okay, and he cannot violate that justice. I think that's a better way to look at wrath.
okay, 'cause I always think
Yeah.
of wrath as anger.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, that's why I said.
Yeah, and I think
in
that's-
the old days he did people.
Right. I think that's probably, I'd like you to have a little different spin on wrath. Okay, it's his need to respond in justice to the problem. Okay? And in that justice, he responds both now in people's lives and in the end in people's lives. Because his love cannot violate his justice. See, he can't send somebody to heaven without Jesus,
Yeah.
as much as he may want to. Yeah, that's a better way to look at it. Okay. Did you have your hand up, Ryan? Did you have a...
So would that just be like passive wrath? Letting us continue to sin?
Yes. On this level, yes. At the Great White Throne Judgment, it's more active.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a withdrawal. Yeah. It's passive in that sense. Yeah. It's somewhat like the parent that won't rescue the kid anymore.
So it's like not enabling them. Basically.
Yeah, exactly. And letting them feel the full impact of what's going on. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, Chris?
I think it's so convicting, and it just exposes how blind, like, namely, like myself, that I've been towards myself. And the fact that how I use Christianity just like the Jews used Judaism. Like, I can rest on Christ's salvation and that he will change me, and, like, I don't really have to necessarily follow, God's commands necessarily. And, like, I usually think of that being legalism, but really it's not. Like, it's like you're saying, or like Paul was saying, it's a lifestyle. It should change your life.
Yeah.
Like, the more that you know, it hinges on, your lifestyle hinges on
Yeah.
what you know. And then it just brings me to Matthew 7. And it just reminds me of a pastor saying that the road gets narrower the more that you
Yeah.
know your life should change to get
Right.
down there.
And what we're going to wrestle with for several weeks, son, is how do I thereby do that so that it doesn't become into a legalistic response, but a grace response. But there must be a response, or I've missed something. Ryan?
So in the process of like learning how not to be legalistic in that sense, are we also going to learn how to like argue that? Because people will argue that we're being legalistic. Are you also going to teach us ways to...
I hope so. I hope to wrestle with some of those kinds of things because, as I said earlier, I want us to take some occasion to try to incarnate these doctrines. How does that then play out in the pew? How does that play out in the pulpit? How does that play out in my daily life as a Christ follower? Okay? All right, just one quick thing before we go. I don't know if you're intrigued or not, but he made the statement in chapter 1 that people have a revelation and a knowledge of God through nature and their inner conscience. Now, what do you think becomes the million-dollar question? Can you guess? Yes, how? But even more than that, is that revelation enough to save them? That becomes the issue. Now, let me just ask you something. Contextually, is he talking salvation? No. What is he talking about? He's talking about a lifestyle in response to what you know. Okay? He really doesn't, Tyler, address and answer the question of, can you get saved if you've never heard the gospel? Are you tracking with me? He doesn't really answer that like we would like him to. But here's what he does say. In some way, and again, Chuck, he doesn't tell me how as much as I wish he would. He says there is, in nature, you can connect the dots that there's a God that has order to him and that has some sort of a response that he's wanting. And that left in you, in spite of the fall, is enough of the image of God, because were you created in the image of God, even as a fallen person, in you is enough of the image of God to give you moral fiber to know you're doing wrong. Now, that may not ever translate out to you know thus, thus, and thus is wrong. Do you know what I mean? You may not know all the specifics, but you know enough that what you're doing is a willful choice against your knowledge and understanding. That's what he's basically saying. That's his argument. Okay? Now, not a revelation. The Roman Catholic Church is open to revelation enough to get you saved. Protestants tend to say, no, I don't think he's going there. But that revelation, that moral fiber in the conscience of an individual, even a fallen individual, gives them enough knowledge to know they're making choices that are contrary to a God, that they can see his hand in nature. That's what I think he's wrestling with. And at that point, those of you that had me with Revelation know that I tend to just leave things at the level of what I think is the intentionality and not try to press more beyond that. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So can the heathen who've never heard get saved? My answer is, I don't know that the Bible addresses it. All that the Bible talks about is coming in through Jesus Christ because you've heard about him. Okay, that's the best way that I can put that. So people have moral fiber more than we might realize because of the residue of the image of God that's left in them. All right.